We are here recording the podcast celebrating the 50th anniversary of the graduating class from what was then the Mount Sinai Medical School, the School of Medicine. Now it's the Icahn School of Medicine, as we all know. These folks will be joining us again for reunion in May, and going to introduce who's at the table. So starting with Dr. Schaefer. Dr. Ernst Schaefer, he is the Chief Medical Officer, Laboratory Director, and co-founder of the Boston Heart Diagnostics in Framingham, Massachusetts. He is also a distinguished university professor at Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being here today. We also have Dr. Naomi Lubin. She is the Vice Chair of Academic Affairs and Vice Chair of the Institutional Review Board in the Office of Human Subjects Protection at Children's National Hospital. She is a tenured professor of pediatrics and pathology at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. She is also the 2022 Jacobi winner for Mount Sinai. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Jeffrey Flyer. He is the Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor and former Dean of Harvard Medical School from 2007 to 2016. He is also a Jacobi winner in 2003. So this marks 50 years since you graduated. However, I would love to take it back even further to your first day of medical school. That is now 55 years ago, 1968, and what was then the Mount Sinai Medical School in a converted bus garage. Now we have the Icahn School of Medicine and a sprawling health system to accompany it. What was it like on the first day of medical school? If you could share some memories that you have, and perhaps Dr. Flyer, I will start with you.
Oh, well, I would say it remains one of the most memorable moments of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I was about to launch or begin the launch of a career in medicine. That felt like quite an important moment in my life. But beginning it on the first day of a new medical school made it an exceptional moment for me. I didn't know what to expect. I knew that there were people there working hard to plan the launch of a new school. Mm-hmm. They could do it in many different ways. What was open to them was a variety of different approaches. And I do remember going into the building, which was well known to have been a bus garage about a year before. It didn't look like a bus garage. We went in, milled around, said hello to some of our fellow students, took seats in the amphitheater, and I know my feeling was this was a historic moment. Mm-hmm. I had the honor of participating in it. There were people sitting in the front row who we rapidly learned were the founders of the school and the chairs of the major departments of the school. And they got up one after the other, including the great Hans Popper, the chair of pathology, who we know was the person who came up with the idea of having a medical school. And he talked in his thick Germanic accent, Austrian Germanic accent, about the founding of the school, and you could tell he was very aware of the history of the moment. The current first dean got up, and several prominent chairs. I had done a little reading, not by Google, because there were no such things then, but I went to the library before I went there, and I read about some of these people, and they were quite amazing people, and I felt very honored to be in their presence. I felt that this was going to be a moment that I would never forget, and that turned out to be true.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And Dr. Lubin, can you express your first day?
I think I was absolutely frightened to death, not really knowing what this was going to be like. Mm-hmm. Was the demands of the first 2 years going to be overwhelming? Was it going to be tolerable? How much studying was there going to be? Where was I going to live? Was I going to have friends? Very, very different from starting college, where when you started college, you just knew that it was going to be 4 years of friendship. Wasn't so clear there were going to be 4 years of friendship here. How competitive was it going to be? Happy to say that it wasn't competitive at all, and that we all really did become friends and brothers and sisters, and got through all 4 years successfully.
terrific.
Most of us,
Yeah.
not all of us, but most of us.
Was there one individual on your first day of medical school that stuck out to you?
And that would have been Hans Popper.
Okay.
Just you could just sense his pride in having come to the moment of being able to have a entering class of women, a few, and men mostly, who he felt were going to be the next great clinicians of the future.
Fantastic. And Dr. Schaefer, you transferred in after 2 years. So your first day at medical school was not at Mount Sinai. However, could you touch upon what the profession was like, the medical profession was like in the 1960s, and why you then chose to come to Mount Sinai after 2 years?
Yeah, did my first 2 years at Dartmouth Medical School, and it was a very small program. And I came to Mount Sinai, first of all, because I was accepted, and second of all, because it was a great hospital. Even though it was a new medical school, it was a great hospital. And at Dartmouth, we had this lengthy questionnaire for physical diagnosis. It was by a Professor Weed at University of Vermont, and it was 100 questions, and I thought it was very hard to get through. When I got to Mount Sinai, one of my first memories is there were 4 of us. There were 12 transfers, but I was in a group of 4. And our first attending was a wonderful doctor. His name was Herschel Sklarov. And we sat around and we were able to see a patient. But what Dr. Sklarov told us instead of a lengthy questionnaire was, when you see the patient, the first thing you ask is, oh, what's the problem? Why are you here? What's your chief complaint? And to me, that made a tremendous amount of success. I didn't feel like I was literally in the weeds, and it made a lot of sense. And he was a great clinician, and that was basically my experience for the clinical years at Mount Sinai was fantastic. These were doctors that practiced medicine, that saw a lot of disease and were very experienced, and so they could pass on this knowledge, this clinical knowledge to us, which was amazing.
So did the clinical rotations per se, that started, or the clinical studies started at the third year? Is that correct?
Predominantly. Not
Okay.
entirely, but predominantly, yeah.
It's actually kind of interesting because now medical students are exposed to the clinical environment through different kinds of shadowing opportunities absolutely at the beginning of their training in year 1. I don't remember us having that much in the way of shadowing experiences.
You mean in medical school?
In medical school. And, that's a difference. Is it a good difference? Should we have had more of that? I think the answer is yes, because I think it really catches a medical student the importance of learning all of the first 2 years, be that if it's an organ system oriented training or if it's just old fashioned biochemistry, chemistry, microbiology, immunology.
But maybe I'll add to that by
Please.
saying that there was a course, I know it was during the first year, it might have been both first and second, that Sinai had for us that had a huge effect on my career and I think was enjoyed by everyone. It was called Introduction to Medicine. They had it a couple of afternoons a week. They picked a disease to be the subject of the sessions. the disease they chose was diabetes, which turned out to be the disease that I studied for 50 years. And the way it worked was the guy who ran the course, Professor Dolger, who was mainly a clinician, he used to have for each session a topic, a guest speaker, a patient who would come in and be interviewed in front of the class, child, a pregnant woman with diabetes, someone else with diabetes with different complications, and we would see the individual interviewed. I can't recall whether we could ask questions or not. Maybe we could, but that was a way that we kind of shadowed at a distance. We weren't in the privacy of a physician's office, but that had a huge effect on me. I may not have had the same effect on everyone. And I think the reason also they chose that disease, in addition to the fact that it was a common disease, it was increasing in frequency, it affected people across the lifespan, had many different medical issues that would arise. But the other reason was that they ended up choosing as their chairman of medicine and chairman of biochemistry people who were world-class figures in the science of those two diseases. And I think maybe when they were thinking about what disease to choose, that fact that they had Solomon Burson as the chair of medicine and Panagiotis Katsayanis as the chair of biochemistry led them to say, hey, let's choose that disease. And that was, to me, a very wise decision, ahead of its time.
The other thing we have to tell you about, though, is Saturday mornings with Dr. Bender.
Please.
So this was totally unique opportunity.
Was this class that Dr. Flower is talking about was on Saturday mornings?
No.
This
No,
is
okay.
This is another
Totally different class.
experience.
Got it.
Different experience. So this is the neurology experience. And it was on Saturday morning. Dr. Morris Bender, famous giant neurology investigator and clinician, would have these sessions where he would bring in a patient, and that patient would have any number of different kinds of diseases, and he would examine the patient in front of whoever was in the audience, which was medical students, residents, fellows, and probably graduate students as well. And often, when you think back on it now, he would ask the individual questions that would be absolutely unacceptable now to ask in front of a big group. And he would also examine them in ways that would be absolutely unacceptable now. But it was an incredible, incredible learning experience.
And at the time, was it acceptable the way he examined and questioned?
It was okay then, wouldn't be okay now.
I guess I will add to that because I do remember those very well. There was a sense, and people used to talk about that this was right at the edge of what should be allowed. At that time, there wasn't a lot of activity that built up around that. But, what Naomi says, for example, he would say to someone in his very unusual voice, he would say, raise your arm, to the patient. And they couldn't raise their arm. And then he would yell at them again, raise your arm, show me you can do it. It was just a way, and you could tell the patient was embarrassed.
Of course.
And, but the story that people would tell was he was just a great clinician who knew how to evoke the findings on the physical exam. And he was quite brilliant. He would be able to evoke some descriptions of symptoms that other people couldn't do. But as Naomi says, today, you'd be fired on the spot if you did that in front of a big auditorium.
But a great learning experience. I want to stress that.
Yeah.
And what was the biggest takeaway for you from that class that you maybe have applied in your career?
I married a neurologist.
Got it.
A kinder one.
And sweeter one.
Right.
Got it.
With a lower voice. He had a really high squeaky
Yeah, he would
voice.
say, raise your hand, raise your hand.
Yeah.
Wow. And Dr. Schaefer, was this did this class really stick out to you too, or was there another type of class or surgery or anything that you did that was
I came in
jaws on
the
the
third
floor?
year, so I wasn't exposed to that. But I would tell you, for me, a life-changing experience was also between my third and fourth year. I rotated through the coronary care unit in the summer, and the attending there was world famous. His name was Charles K. Friedberg. He was the author of one of the last single-authored textbooks of cardiology. Of course, he had other people that helped him, but so I remember the first week I was there, 3 patients died from their coronary disease, and even though I thought the care had been perfect, one of them had an autopsy. So I went down to the autopsy suite to see what was going on, and this person actually, who was a man in his 60s, had his coronary arteries were totally clogged up, and I was amazed he'd lived as long as he did. So I went back to Dr. Friedberg and I said, well, what causes this disease? And he says, well, high blood pressure has something to do with aging, but why don't you go and read about it? So I went to the Jacobi Library and I read about it. And I came back to him and I said, well, it looks like, high blood pressure and diabetes and smoking, but also cholesterol seems to be quite important. And he said, well, cholesterol is not as important because a lot of these patients have normal cholesterol. Of course, now we know it's how the cholesterol is carried on the good and bad particles. But anyway, that prompted me to get really interested in the process of atherosclerosis. And then I went to see Dr. Burson, and he said, well, there's nobody here really that knows a lot about this. Why don't you go up to Einstein and do a 3-month research rotation with a man named Howard Eder? And at Dr. Burson's advice, I did that, and it's what led me to my career.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So that one class and professor really kind of changed the trajectory of your career.
Well, the
or inspired
cardiology,
it.
the doctors, a lot of my classmates at Dartmouth ended up at Harvard, and they felt they didn't get such a good experience, actually, because not many people paid much attention to them. Here at Mount Sinai, we got a lot of attention, and if we asked questions, people would answer our questions and take us seriously, and that was, for me, a blessing. And these were terrific people who were actually world famous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I will
Please.
just add that knowing Ernie from the earliest days, his career as an expert on lipid disorders and coronary disease as a researcher and clinician is really up there in the top 1% of people who've worked in that field for, decades. So I want you to know that this isn't just something he decided to do and he hung out for a while. He is a major authority in that area. In fact, on the train down, we exchanged papers. He gave me one that he's working on in this area, and I gave him one that I just got accepted. And we're going to talk about more on the way back.
That's fantastic. Have your paths crossed in your careers?
Yes.
Overlap quite significantly, or?
Well, we both lived in Boston, since the late 70s, early 80s, and we've had, periodic social interactions, and then various ways that we interacted because, I'm an endocrinologist. I've been interested in metabolism and lipids, and it was very clear that Ernie was one of the people whose work you had to know, and he was over at Tufts, and that's not that far away. So that's how we interacted.
So, question for you, Dr. Lubin, on the subject of the giants of Mount Sinai, and you touched upon your first day of medical school, how Hans Popper was really, really stood out to you. Throughout your time at Mount Sinai and even your career, are you able to name any other giants of Mount Sinai and really notable leaders that
Absolutely.
shaped your career?
Absolutely. Pediatrics was never a major force at Sinai after Jacobi. They never developed a children's hospital, for example, like Columbia PNS with babies, or University of Pennsylvania with CHOP, or Boston. But that being said, Horace Hodes was a great in pediatric infectious diseases, and he was the chair of pediatrics, and very, very influential, in particular, in my life and my career. He had as his right hand a person that was always available to medical students. Remember who?
Stanley Uretsky.
Stanley Uretsky.
Oh, he was terrific.
Who, anytime you didn't know what you were doing as a medical student or a resident or maybe even a fellow, Stanley was there with the right approach, the right diagnostic tests, and held your hand and taught you everything you needed to know when there were no attendings around. Dr. Hodes had recognized in me, at least, that I had spent several summers in a research lab and I needed to continue my research type of career. And so my first summer, between first and second year, I was allowed to do a research project at Beth Israel on babies born to methadone-addicted mothers. And I spent the whole summer in the neonatal intensive care unit and also in the OBGYN clinics at Beth Israel. And then the next year, after that success, he directed me to another project, which was with immunology diagnostics and early diagnosis of pregnancy using stick tests. Now,
Can you explain what a stick test is?
yeah, you pee on a stick and
Okay.
it tells you whether you're pregnant or not.
Okay.
Nobody ever took it to the next step, but of course, that's now how you are diagnosing pregnancy. So it was very innovative in its time, but it never went to that second, third, fourth steps of being entrepreneurial and turning into an actual medical device. But those 2 summers just, set me on a very specific path, which was augmented by the fact that we had here at Sinai some of the most notable immunohematologists in the United States. And I was mentioning, I think, to other people before this conversation, Carl Landsteiner, Alex Wiener, who named RH, hemolytic disease, and developed the methodology to do exchange transfusions, along with Philip Levine. Now, those 3 people are, just known in the blood banking world as absolute giants, and all 3 of them had connections here at Sinai, and through talking with Dr. Hodes and Stanley, because you never called him Dr. Umansky, you only called him Stanley, that sort of set me on my path of studying transfusion medicine, pediatric hematology, and doing what I've done for the past 45 years of my career.
That's huge. And any female giants that?
No.
No. Okay.
There was one.
Oh, there was
Dorothy Krieger. She was a noted endocrinologist. She was terrific. And Ruth Abramson in kidney disease was outstanding, along with Marvin Levitt in the kidney field. So there are any number of people,
And Lottie Strauss in pathology, who did a lot of neonatal and fetal pathology way before that was ever even recognized.
And you learned directly from her as well? Or?
She was not a major force in our teaching of pathology. I never came across her in any of the other ancillary things that I did, but you knew of her work.
Okay.
And I'll just say a word about Dorothy Krieger, just
Sure.
because I think she deserves mention. Dorothy was an endocrinologist and a researcher in that period of endocrinology, and she was the leader in thinking about how the brain regulates the endocrine system, which is now a giant mega field in and of itself. But she was one of the first people to work in that field. She was an impressive doctor and educator and researcher, and I was beginning to decide that I was going to be an endocrinologist, so I had a certain affinity for her, went to her for advice on a number of occasions. She became my advisor. I think we all had to have an advisor who we chose from the faculty. She was my advisor. She became my wife's advisor, who was 4 years behind me here, and she was at our wedding. So, and then she died too young from breast cancer in her late 50s. But I do want to mention her name.
Thank you.
There's one other person.
Yes.
So our head of medicine unfortunately died of a heart attack prematurely at 51. That's Dr. Burson.
Mm-hmm.
And he and a woman named Rosalind Yallow developed the radioimmunoassay, which is a methodology for measuring peptides in the blood that are at low concentrations. And for example, the first immunoassay for insulin was developed by Burson and Yallow. And in fact, in 1977, and Jeff knows this much better than I do, she won the Nobel Prize for the RIAs in polypeptides in the field of metabolism. But the most important, well, one of the most important one of those was the RIA for insulin, and the fact that it was thought that diabetics must be deficient in insulin, and there are some, but there are also many that are resistant to insulin and have higher levels. So that was a major contribution on the part of Burson and Yallow. And Dr. Yallow ran the radioisotope lab at the Bronx VA Hospital, which was one of our teaching hospitals.
Okay.
Well,
Thank
maybe
you for that. Yeah.
if there's time, I'll add a couple of comments about Saul Burson on a personal level. So I remember on the first day of school, he was one of the ones who stood up and said hello. And I felt I could tell that this was one of the more brilliant people I had ever seen. Something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. I asked questions about him, and it turns out he never had research training. He had great difficulty getting into medical school, but finally got into NYU Medical School. And then when he came back from, I guess, service in the war, he worked on radioisotopes. And Razialo, who Ernie mentioned, became his research partner. She was one of the, she had a degree in physics but couldn't get an academic job because people felt you couldn't be a physicist and be a woman. So together, they were a powerhouse team. He was a chess champion, a concert violinist, and an all-around brilliant man. And by the time he was hired to be the chair of medicine at Mount Sinai, he was, I think, 49 or 50, and it showed unbelievable judgment that they chose him. Because from the time I first heard about him, people were saying he was going to win the Nobel Prize, because this method that they had figured out doesn't only measure insulin, doesn't only measure hormones, it measures hundreds of things that couldn't be measured before. It was
Absolutely.
an approach to measuring molecules that previously couldn't be measured. And here was insulin that was discovered in 1922, for which the Nobel Prize was given in 1923. And until they were able to do it in 1963 or so, no one could measure insulin in the blood and say, what happened? What, is it high? Is it low? What happens when you eat? It was unknown. They figured it out and then applied it to many, many other things. And I used to periodically go visit his lab and talk with him. Make a long story short, when I was a third-year student during the Vietnam War, many doctors were being drafted. And you may not have heard about this, but there was something called the lottery. You would be given a random number. It told you where you stood in the lottery, and it said whether you had a high likelihood of being drafted or a low likelihood of being drafted.
The
And
Berry plan, right?
Well, the Berry plan is a part of that, but it was I had a draftable number. I didn't particularly want to be a doctor in the Vietnam War after graduating from medical school. So what I did was I looked for other options. And the best option that I could find, other than going to Canada, which some people did, was I applied to the National Institutes of Health to be in the public health service rather, where you could go after, let's say, a couple of years of residency, and you would be in one of several hundred labs at NIH. And some of them were purely research, some of them were research and clinical training, and some were mainly clinical. I was deciding that I was going to do that, or try to do it, because it was very hard to get in. It was very competitive. And I'll just end the story by saying I went to see Dr. Burson in like November of 1967. No, 1967. And he saw me, and I said, Dr. Burson, I have these interests. I think I want to be an endocrinologist. And I want to go to the NIH, but I don't know which lab to go into. They had one of these matches where you had to, apply to different labs, and they would match you to one. He said, Jeff, there's no issue. You're going to the lab of Jesse Roth. He was my first student. He runs the diabetes branch at the NIH. I'll call him up when you leave, and you'll be accepted, and you should go there. And that's what I did. And that was the basis for my having the scientific career and ultimately other career that I did. And if I hadn't asked him, or if he hadn't told me that, I have no idea what I would have done. Where I'd be. I wouldn't be in this room now, most likely. But so that's another story about Saul Burson. And then in the spring of my senior year, when I was going to be doing an internship at Mount Sinai, starting in July, he died at a national meeting at age, I think, 54. And, I could never, I always dreamt that I would become an adult colleague of his. I've had a picture of him in my office from the time I had an office.
Wow.
And I will say, if the leadership of the school ever is listening to this, you should have a Solomon Burson professorship at Mount Sinai. It's kind of embarrassing to me that there isn't one, as far as I know.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few other things about Jeff. When I was a medical student here, I applied for all these awards, and the person that always won them was this guy named Jeff Flyer. And I didn't know him. I didn't know him very well then, but then when we were interns, we were in the same group, and then I understood why he was winning all these awards. But he went to the NIH a year before I did, so I visited him down there when I was planning to go there also. And he told me, well, I know all the ways that the insulin receptor doesn't work, but I don't really know how it does work. But shortly thereafter, he made a major discovery. He found these patients that made antibodies against the insulin receptor, and they caused diabetes in them. And it was a very important fundamental discovery. So he finally did what was it in research. Sometimes you really have to struggle until you make a breakthrough, and that was one of Jeff's major breakthroughs.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ernie.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Well, that's the truth.
One thing I really want to ask you all, since we're around the table, is you were in medical school at Mount Sinai, height of the Vietnam War, and in the yearbook we have photos of protests and people on the streets. There's big masses of people. There's even a photo of some medical students making signs, like picket signs in the labs, in the classrooms. Do you have a particular story about that? Were you part of the protests? I know you kind of skirted the lottery in some sense and went to the NIH. I don't know if Dr. Lubin, you have a particular story you'd like to touch upon?
Sure. So I have no idea what my career would have been like had I not ended up at Children's National /GW. And the only reason I was there is because my husband pulled a draft number 1.
Whoa.
And he was at Einstein and also applied to a program at the NIH and was accepted into it. And so the only reason why I ever ended up in Washington, D.C. was because of him and his being at the NIH for the Public Health Service, which he did for 2 years, and then continued his training. And we came back to New York, and I was then at Cornell, Memorial Sloan Kettering, the New York Blood Center, and the Rockefeller. After that, I was recruited back to Children's because I was deemed somebody that had a lot of skills, and they needed a lot of the skills that I had. I personally did not partake in any of those kinds of protests in medical school, but I did in college.
Okay.
And so I think one thing that people forget is how long that
Very long.
war went on and how many years of potential protests there was. I also had 2 cousins who moved to Canada because they didn't want to be drafted.
Absolutely.
And so that sort of split up our Boston family somewhat.
Well, maybe I'll add to that with a couple of reflections. So I went to college at CCNY. Like most places, most people weren't very active, but there was a very visible, strong group of anti-war protesters. Some of them were just anti-war. Some of them were very left-wing. I remember various groups. And I was opposed to the war, but I didn't agree with the approach of some of those groups. When I came to Mount Sinai, it was really at the peak of all of this. It was, I won't name names, but it's clear that there were some members of our class who had been leaders of student protests at their universities. This was in their DNA. They had recently been doing it, and by God, they were going to keep doing it when they came. And nothing wrong with that. And then there were other people who were sympathetic, but realized, I have to study biochemistry, and I can't do it the same way that I might have. And then there were other people who just said, look, I'm going to take this time to learn to be a doctor, and I don't want to be part of this. We had some episodes that I won't try to relate where some group of people wanted to sit in the dean's office and have certain demands met. Some people went to that. I know I didn't. I don't think you did. But what I would say is that over the course of the 4 years, it was like a regression to the mean. It stopped being the core thing, even for the people who were very interested in it. And best as I could tell, it's hard to tell the difference 50 plus years later between the people who were doing it and the people who were not doing it in terms of how they live their lives, what they do, etc. So it's just an interesting and important phase historically and personally for how that played out. You couldn't be completely neutral in 1968 over those issues.
Got it. And Dr. Schaefer, did you partake? What was your...
Well, yeah, a lot of us were against the war, and my wife and I, in fact, went to D.C. for some marches and participated, and actually there was a nickname for doctors that went to the NIH. We called ourselves the Yellow Berets as opposed to the Green Berets. But the fact of the matter is it was a terribly misguided war, and it took 20 years to end it. And I think almost to a person, everybody who was a student was against the war, especially as it progressed and they began learning more about it. So it was not a good chapter in the U.S. history.
I'd also like to add one other thing, which is the number of women that were accepted to medical school during that block of time was very, very small, and probably exaggeratedly small, because deans and medical school admissions folks didn't want to lose a place, put that in quotes, to a woman when they could fill the spot with a male. So the fact that there were so few women between 68 and really about 85 obviously much better now. I don't know what it is at Harvard Medical School, but at GW, we're at 72% female.
Yeah.
Wow.
At
We're at
Tufts Medical
52.
at Tufts Medical School, it's about 60% women, which is a good thing. I think.
Yes,
Yeah, it's a good thing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
In all specialties.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
not only in pediatrics and
Yeah.
OBGYN, in surgery, surgical subspecialty disciplines, psychiatry, psychology for PhDs, and so it's much, much more reflective of the population of the U.S., number
Yes.
one, but also I think really provides a major benefit for patients.
Absolutely. So at Mount Sinai Medical School, you were one of 4 women to your first year, correct? And then you graduated one of 7 women. Now, what was it like specifically in the classroom to be one of the very few females there? Was it hospitable? Did you feel as though you were an equal? Was there more competition? Right? Would you be able to talk through your specific experience at school in the classroom?
Sure. I would say that one of the unique elements of our class, I can't speak for subsequent classes, but our class was one of inclusiveness. So I never felt that I was outside of the group. Now, you do have to know that I had Jeff as one of my anatomy partners,
And she was a great dissector, I
I-
can tell you.
you know, the pathology kind of comes in there a little bit too, probably. But I never felt in any way, shape, or form at all excluded. I did follow recommendations from my older sister, who is a PhD immunologist, who actually was at Tufts for many years. And basically she said, do not date anyone in the class. You know, you keep your social life separate from your working environment. And I did follow that. So I had a lot of brothers,
Yep.
but no dates.
Okay.
But that was okay.
That was strategic. That's fantastic. Wow. Thank you so much. And it's great to see how it's shifted. Right now, 50 years ago, you were one of 7 in your graduating class, and now you just said like 60% of the class across all fields and all disciplines make up for it.
Well, I'll add a little anecdote. So, my wife, Terry Murados Flyer, entered Mount Sinai when I was an intern. And we met because Inez Greenstadt, who used to give out free tickets and arrange social things at the school, told me one day that I was walking by her office that there was going to be a wine and cheese party to introduce the interns to the new medical students. I might want to go. I went. I met Terry, and we've been married since 1975. She's a doctor. Has been a professor at Harvard Medical School. And both of our daughters are doctors. One went to Mount Sinai and did a residency at Mount Sinai and is now a gastroenterologist in Boston. And the other went to Harvard Medical School and is a primary care doctor in Boston at one of our hospitals. So from my personal vantage point, women are all there are in medicine. And it's perfectly fine with me. I love it.
Absolutely.
There's something else. Jeff mentioned this woman, Inez Greenstadt, but she was great at, well, what she would do is she hand out free tickets. And a lot of us as students didn't have much money, but we got tickets to free off-Broadway shows.
Nice.
So my wife and I saw some of the worst Broadway shows ever off-Broadway, but it was something to do and we enjoyed it.
That was the best thing
Yeah.
because you would go, and if it was horrible, you just walked out, and you didn't feel bad about it because you didn't pay for it.
That's
So
right.
true.
That's right. And we played in the nursing school auditorium gym. We would play basketball, and there were attendings that would come and play with us, younger attendings, and we had some great times there. And we used to, across the street on Sunday mornings, we'd play touch football, rain or shine, and with the residents and medical students. It was wonderful time for me. Yeah, I was here for 5 years. It was great. Yeah.
Are there any like one-off or kind of crazy stories from your time at Mount Sinai in the sense of like, I don't know, if someone fainted during a surgery and like everything went wrong? Yes, Dr. Lubin.
I was committed early on to pediatrics, maybe neonatology, wasn't entirely sure, maybe OB/GYN, but definitely had that theme. And I had the opportunity to scrub in on a C-section with Percy Klingenstein of the Klingenstein Pavilion family,
Yep.
famous name. And this was like a rare event.
Okay.
There were not many medical students that could scrub in with him. So my heart was beating rapidly, and I got into my scrubs, and I stood in the OR by his side. He handed me a retractor. I held the retractor, and I fainted.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I will add my fainting story. So when we were doing dissection, there was a ear, nose, and throat surgeon who was helping us with the head dissection. I don't remember his name, but at the end of it, he said, maybe to all of us, but he certainly said to me, if you'd like to come scrub with me in an operation, I'm doing one tomorrow, So I agreed, and I went, and I did the usual thing. I went there, I scrubbed, I put on the gown. I started to smell the aromas of the operating room. I was told to stand in a very specific position and not move. And as he was making the first cut in the neck, I said, I am going to faint. And they came behind me, they sat me down. I probably sat there for, 10 minutes. Then I got up again, and they said, you can leave now. And,
Don't come back.
right. And it was at that moment that I knew I was not going to be a surgeon.
Okay. Was
Maybe that was a
similar-
mistake. I might have been a great surgeon. But
But I have a continuation of that story. So it turns out that I have extraordinarily low blood pressure.
Oh, okay.
And
How
So did
low
someone-
is your
How
nose?
Did
low is
someone
low.
catch you when did you fall? Did someone catch you? Did you give warning?
I just ended up on the OR floor.
Okay.
And, I think my blood pressure was something like 30 palp by the time they came over to resuscitate me. And so forevermore, I never stand still. I'm always moving. You might have noticed this during this podcast. My legs are always moving. Otherwise, I get to 30 palp and I faint.
Okay.
But it's protecting my heart and my head, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't think that Ernie has ever fainted during
Yeah.
an operation.
No, but I did scrub on a couple of cases, and remember in orthopedic, one of the early times they were doing hip replacements, and both Jeff and I have had hip replacements. So, but what was surprising to me is in the OR, the surgeon would dislocate the hip
Oh
and
gosh.
take a saw and cut off the head of the femur, and then take this.
That's how you
spike,
do it.
and take this spike and have a little hammer and drive this thing into the femur to form the ball of the hip. I said, "Geez, this is it's like amazing." But that was the first prosthesis was the Charnley prosthesis, and I think it was the surgeon was very good. His name was Roger Levy, and he was one of the orthopedic surgeons. And because of that experience, I almost went into orthopedics, but ended up in internal medicine. But the surgeons here, Arthur Ausis was the head of surgery. He was outstanding, and Erwin Gallant and a lot of other people were really terrific. And of course, we all ran into Burl Crone, who described Crohn's disease. He was at this hospital, and he was the one that always taught us if you can prevent a patient from having surgery where they take out feet of intestine, do so by trying to unobstruct the patient. And that was an important lesson for me for later on when I ran a clinical service at the NIH, because we had some problems like that. But he was, so that's just another example of a giant that was here at Mount Sinai.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They're flooding with giants.
Yes,
Almost.
yes.
Maybe I'll make a comment
Sure.
about something I think worth pointing out, which is when we were students at Mount Sinai on the clinical service, we each had attending rounds. Usually there were 2 or 3 attendings on each round, not just one, so you got to hear several different opinions. But what I recall most profoundly was that most of the physicians who admitted patients to Mount Sinai were in private practice, which now represents probably 20% of American doctors. Most of them work for large groups or hospitals and such. And the most memorable physicians from whom I learned the most were these private doctors, some of them on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue. And the thing that was clear was if I was on a night call on a Saturday night, 10 o'clock, patient came in of Dr. Sklaroff, let's say, or I could name 20 other names. The patient would come in, they were sent in by their doctor, you do your examination, you start to put a plan together, and then while you're doing that, Dr. Sklaroff or XYZ would come walking down the hall on a Saturday night, and they'd say, hey, how's the patient doing? And you give your best answer, and they say, okay, I think that's right, but why don't you think about this? And then they would take, I remember this many, many times, they would take us into some back room where you were able to sit around a table, and you'd get a talk for an hour about this disorder, the patient, and that's where the most important stuff was that I learned. And it was over and over again, those kind of doctor relationships. You probably know that today it has dramatically changed away from that, so that most hospitals have hospitalists. These are people, wonderful people, take a job where their job is to be there during the day or during the night or whatever. They don't know the patients, but they're responsible for the patients when they're in the hospital. And it varies somewhat depending on where you live in the hospital, but often the patient's actual doctor doesn't come in, doesn't play any role, or in fact, usually they don't want them to play a role unless some special issue comes up. So this is a huge difference from medicine as we experienced it as students here, and students elsewhere as well, and medicine today. Now, there are trade-offs, there are advantages to hospitalists. Not all the doctors would come in when they should have, and then you'd be maybe trying to reach them and you couldn't get their opinion. But I'll just stop there and see if you folks have any thoughts about that.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I mean, no PowerPoints. These people would just
Lecture.
speak from their knowledge base, which was absolutely incredible because the depth of their knowledge was just limitless. It was just really, really a wonderful way to learn. Plus, you couldn't fall asleep because you were in a small room and everything was very, very much one-on-one, 3-on-1, 4-on-1. So I think that was a really major notable difference. Of course, if you were in pediatrics, you had Stanley.
Yes.
And more, you had Stanley. And in that room that he would talk to you in, there were Hershey's chocolate bars. And so you could get your sugar boost while you were learning. And therefore, you never forgot anything.
Correct.
Stanley was
the man.
Stanley was there 24/7.
Yeah.
That was his life to be on.
We used to think he had a cot
Yeah.
somewhere in a back room.
We did have one student in our class who would always sit in the front row, and the professor would give a lecture, and this fellow would be nodding off like this, But invariably, the professor would call on him, and he would wake up and answer the question, and then he'd start nodding off again. He was famous in our class for doing that. But it was, in general, it was a terrific experience.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I suppose we could talk for hours and hours and hours about this, but to kind of put a nice bow on this conversation, We spoke a lot about the Giants of Sinai, your experience. You've all had these exceptional and are having these exceptional careers and have been influential to so many people around you. Is there anything in particular that maybe you learned from one of your mentors at Mount Sinai that you have since passed on to one of your mentees, or any guidance, anything like that?
I'll start.
Fantastic.
Always listen. Listening is everything. Asking question after question after question and listening to the answers. That helps you with correct diagnoses, which lead you to correct diagnostic tests, which leads you, hopefully, to some sort of therapeutic intervention.
Fantastic. To listen. Okay. Dr. Flyer, anything other than to listen?
Well, I certainly agree with Naomi's comments there. Maybe I'll redirect the question slightly. That's what you do as a dean, you know.
Yeah, go for
I'll
it.
answer the question that I want to answer. Yeah. No, so what I would say is not so much that a particular mentor told me this, but in my role as a mentor, I would frequently tell people, don't overthink what your career is going to be. Look for what you think will give you the greatest pleasure and opportunity that's facing you right now. But from my experience, many people have many different careers during the course of a medical life. And you can't always, frequently, you cannot predict what these opportunities are going to be. No one will be able to tell you, oh yes, you should do that as opposed to that. But be open to surprises and possibilities. One of the things about medicine is, in addition to choosing different specialties, there are people who have major patient-facing roles. There are people who do research. There are people who combine it. There are people who do policy. There are people who go in and start businesses or become advisors to businesses. There are people who go into politics. So medicine is an enabling profession. It's probably only going to be more enabling over time. And enjoy the fact that you don't have to know what you're going to be doing at age 60 while you're 26 or something.
That's great advice.
And maybe I'll add a little bit to that as well. Somebody early on in my career advised me to take all of the things that I love, try to put them together, and develop a niche. And I was very successful in doing that. And so when I have a large number of junior faculty mentors now because of the role that I currently have, and I try to do that with them and find that they thank me for having made that recommendation. Now, it'll be 5-10 years until we sort of see how they all end up. But I think that it was wise advice to me, and I like to pass that along, in particular to junior faculty. Maybe not medical students or fellows, but junior faculty who already have a bit of a direction.
Okay. Listening, specializing, not being afraid to take chances or be caught up on your career.
I just wanted to say that, as you heard from Jeff and Naomi, it's important to listen, but it's also important for the student to reach out to the doctor or the professor and find a good mentor. And one of the things that happened, I think, to all three of us here at Mount Sinai is we asked questions and we were given, people took us seriously and listened to what our questions were and steered us in what we all three consider to be important directions for our careers.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
In fact, this may not make it into the final cut, which is fine, but I have to give one more example of how there was an openness to responding to students. So after a lecture that we heard in the first year, I went up to the lecturer, who was Professor Kurt Hirschhorn, who for maybe 30 years was the chair of pediatrics at Mount Sinai, a prominent scientist as well. And I went up with some questions, and he said, oh, it looks like you're really interested in this. Why don't you come to my office tomorrow afternoon? Went to his office. We talked for an hour. And he said, you should do some time in my lab. if you come on certain afternoons, we'll give you a project, you know, and I hadn't even thought of that in a million years. And that's what I did. I went, and I ended up publishing a paper with him, my first paper. And then he said to me, Jeff, you know, why don't you take a summer off between the second and third year before you start? I have a friend at the Karolinska Institute, Professor George Klein. He runs the Tumor Biology Institute. I'm going to call him up and say, would you be able to take this student? He's a good guy. And that's what I did. I had the opportunity to go to Stockholm, spend 2 months at the Karolinska Institute. And, Kurt Hirschhorn was a hero to me. And I understand he passed away just a few months ago. I think he was coming into his office until the last few weeks. And I was telling these guys on the walk over here that his son, Joel Hirschhorn, was a Harvard medical student. My wife was assigned him as her student advisee, not having any idea, that Joel Hirschhorn. Turns out that he was the son. And I had the pleasure of being an MC over his receiving an endowed professorship at Harvard Medical School, and Kurt was sitting, in the front row. So these kind of personal relationships are amongst the most powerful things that can happen, and wouldn't have happened at all if I hadn't gone up to talk to Kurt Hirschhorn, if he hadn't invited me to his office. And those are the kinds of things that I was mentioning that are, impossible to predict, but, go with them when they're there.
Take the opportunity.
Yep.
And last sentence, perhaps, is there anything you want to say to your other classmates or your class? Since this is the podcast episode for 1972 graduating classes and the 50th anniversary.
I'll just say,
Okay.
I only wish that in the years since we graduated, there were more ways for us to keep in touch and get together. I'm so impressed by the people who I've recently seen in some Zoom get-togethers, and that it's kind of shocking that I haven't seen them for 50 years. But in many ways, many of them seem like the same people. They look a little different. They've gone through a lot. They've accomplished a lot. But, it's been a great pleasure for me to get to see them again.
Absolutely. Any?
Just, I think my final words would be, as many of these folks are kind of moving into retirement or are already in retirement, that they need to remember to always pay back. And the best way to pay back is to use their medical and their scientific knowledge at the lowest level possible. So get out there and do some STEM activities with kindergartners and with elementary school teachers, and share your knowledge and your excitement about science with the youngest of the young, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to accomplish an enormous amount in the future as far as scientific creativity, curiosity, and hopefully more and more therapeutics.
Fantastic. Dr. Schaefer, anything in particular?
Yeah, I would just like to say that the three of us here are academics and professors, and we've all been involved in clinical medicine, but there are a fair number of people in our class that have made huge contributions as practicing doctors day in, day out. And I can think of any number of them, and I salute them for their many years of excellent clinical medicine that they've given to their patients, and looking forward to seeing many of them at our reunion in May.
For the hundreds and thousands of medical school listeners that we have right now, what is a piece of evergreen or timeless advice that you would give that was applicable from when you were in school, from when you were 25 years old to right now?
I'll start off by saying that be aware while you're in medical school that you are being given the opportunity to enter, the privilege to enter one of the great professions to which any individual can be a member, that has as its core values the health and wellness of the population, that puts you in a special relationship with your patients. And whatever you end up doing, whether you end up becoming a teacher or a politician or a practicing doctor or a researcher, that bit of privilege in the positive sense, not the negative sense, should be with you.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. Dr. Lubin?
So my words of wisdom are to seek out mentorship, never mentorship from one person alone. You need scientific mentorship, clinical mentorship, research mentorship, and you need peer mentorship.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, always remember that you need to give back and mentor others. So mentor down as well as be mentored up.
Fantastic. Dr. Schaefer?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. I guess the only thing I would say is find a passion, find an area where you think you can make a contribution that really interests you, and then seek out people who can help you in that area, along with obviously trying to deliver the best patient care that you can.
Thank you so much for being here and representing the class of 1972. Like I said, we could talk for hours and dive deep into every single possible question that was asked and answer that was received. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your stories, your advice. It is invaluable, and this session is certainly something that we will keep and hold closely and share widely. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Of course.
Great to be here.